I'm a hardcore boxing fan, and I'm going to tell you a little secret. I'm interested in Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis because it addresses that core question, that thing that we always try and answer. At what point does size override skill? How big is too big? This absolute freak show of a matchup speaks directly to this question. And in this video, I'm going to be trying to address it. Is Gervonta Davis simply too small to be able to beat Jake Paul in a boxing ring? Does he have enough punch power to hurt Jake Paul? Will he even be able to reach his chin? And will Jake Paul find that despite he is by far the naturally bigger man, the skill gap on this occasion is just far too much for him? I get into it all in this video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to A Guy Called Henry. I'm sure some of my regular viewers might be surprised to see me covering this event. But as I said in my intro, there is something about this fight that does appeal to me because it does address that core question, how big is too big? Just before I jump into this video, I want to let everyone know that I'm going to be assuming this is a legitimate fight because I know there's been countless questions that have asked about Jake Paul's fights, the exhibitions, the strange rules, etc., etc. And based on the rules we've been given, it's a 195-pound catchweight. It's going to be 10 3-minute rounds, and they're going to be using 12-ounce gloves. Outside of that, it's simply impossible for us to know if there's any no knockout agreements or anything of that sort. And so I'm going to be treating this as a genuinely competitive matchup that's taking place within the usual rules of boxing. I mean, to an extent. We'll get into the weight in a moment. Just before I jump in, guys, please don't forget to bang a like on the video if indeed you do like it. Don't forget to subscribe to A Guy Called Henry if you're new, and get a comment in the comment section below. What the hell do you make of this fight? Is it going to be competitive? Do you just have absolutely no interest? And who do you think is going to be the likely winner? Now, I think it's really important to put this fight into context at the beginning of this video here. So let's start with Jake Paul. What is his boxing career? What has it been? Because a lot of people struggle to understand the context of what he's achieved so far. Now, when you go to Jake Paul's box rec, it says that he is 12-1 with 7 KOs. But in reality, only 5 of those opponents, so less than half, have been actual real boxers. But every single one of those boxers has a considerable problem. After fighting influencers, ex-basketball players, and ex-MMA fighters, the first real boxer that he fought was Tommy Fury. Now, Tommy Fury is a real boxer in the sense that he had previously had professional fights. He came from a boxing background, of course, being the younger brother of Tyson Fury. And he's not someone who's got any considerable level of ability. I would personally rank Tommy Fury somewhere around British level. It's hard to say without him actually having fought at that level before. But I think Tommy Fury is actually slightly smaller than Jake Paul. Despite this, Jake Paul lost the fight. He did manage to knock Tommy Fury down with a lead hand towards the end of the fight, but he clearly lost the fight on points. To put context to this, Tommy Fury then went on to fight influencer KSI, and in my opinion, KSI actually won that fight using a crazy style. It was absolutely all over the place style, very unorthodox, that uses so much energy that surely KSI couldn't do that for much longer than the 6 rounds that they were in there for. Tommy Fury got the decision there, but just a little side note. After that, Jake went back to fighting an MMA fighter in Nate Diaz, and then he fought a couple of fighters back-to-back in Andre August and Ryan Borland, who are 2 guys I'd never heard of before, but are active professional fighters. Sorry, we use the term active very loosely here. So let's look at Andre August's box rec. He's had 2 fights. He had a fight in 2023, one against a guy called Brandon Martin, and he lost to Jake Paul. Before that, he hadn't had a fight for 4 years. And even, in those fights, an unknown quantity. I don't know who the guy is. I assume he's not a particularly high level. And again, Ryan Borland, he'd only had 1 fight when he fought Jake Paul in 2024. Since 2018, he'd fought a guy called Santario Martin 2 years prior to that. Other than that, he already had a couple of losses on his record. And again, another unknown quantity. He then fought a bare knuckle fighter called Mike Perry, who I believe had 1 boxing fight and lost in his debut, before moving into fighting what was one of the most viewed fights of all time against Mike Tyson. Some of you may have found this channel during that time, and we covered it extensively. I never expected Mike Tyson to be able to compete in that fight owing to the fact he is so damn old. The guy's legs are gone. He can't fight like that anymore. And it was always pretty obvious that despite the fact that Jake Paul will never be close to the level of ability and talent that Mike Tyson displayed at his best, that he'd be able to win the fight simply because he had the legs and the athleticism and he could actually move around the ring. Boxing's all on the legs for those of you that haven't realized that yet. If you can't move them, you kind of can't fight because you can't get close. This brings us to Jake's most recent fight, which was against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., son of the legendary fighter Julio Cesar Chavez, of course. And Jake won this fight pretty comfortably, and on the surface, again, it's another fight that Jake has picked to further his career with minimal risk. Chavez Jr. is a big name in Mexico and in America. And whilst he was a champion at middleweight many, many years ago, we're talking 2012, which is literally 13 years ago, he's always been riddled with issues. And, this fight was up at cruiserweight. And prior to this, Chavez had all sorts of out-the-ring issues, in and out of rehab. Very troubled guy who Jake Paul, again, clearly picked to build some legitimacy and to, get a more of a record going. And this fight was a massively painful thing to watch because if you go and take a look at it, yes, Jake Paul won a unanimous decision and he certainly deserved it because Chavez Jr. didn't throw a punch for the first bloody 70% of the fight. It was absolutely ridiculous and I don't know what he was doing, but Jake Paul won it comfortably and in the end, maybe Chavez didn't think he was fit enough to throw punches for more than a round, but that was what we saw anyway. So Jake Paul's record is kind of a fallacy. We really have no clue how good he is. And I'm very confident in saying that he would really struggle if he was put in there against any kind of decent level operator who weighed roughly the same as him. Gervonta Davis, on the other hand, is a completely different kettle of fish. This is an established multi-weight world champion who has fought as high as 140 pounds. He's a genuine bona fide star of boxing. He's one of the pound-for-pound best fighters in the world. But the criticism of Gervonta Davis over his career has been that he hasn't fought the biggest challenges that are available to him. There was a period where, himself, Shakur Stevenson, Teofimo Lopez, Lomachenko, they were all in and around the same weight class, and Gervonta Davis has never fought any of them. The best he could really do for us in terms of a name was fighting Ryan Garcia, who had a rehydration clause in the contract and frankly isn't at his level in terms of boxing ability, and he got taken out with relative ease from Gervonta Davis. He's 30-0-1 with 28 knockouts. He's a genuine knockout puncher in the lower weight classes, a ridiculously high knockout percentage. And he's someone who's frustrated boxing fans because at the end of the day, he's an elite fighter and we want to see him really tested. The Shakur Stevenson fight or the controversial fight he had recently where he drew with Lamont Roach, the rematch and that were the two fights that people really would have liked to have seen. I personally thought Lamont Roach won that fight if you go back and watch it. He certainly won it even without the knockdown that wasn't called a knockdown being scored. So if they'd scored that, Roach easily would have won. But on my scorecard, even without that being called, he won the fight. And so Gervonta Davis' own career hasn't been without controversy, but at least it's been in an actual boxing ring against actual boxers. So you might be asking, why does this fight intrigue me, given that the skill gap is clearly quite so enormous? One has gone and achieved the highest feats you possibly can in boxing. The other has absolutely created an illusion, a facade, and flattered to deceive. Well, it comes down to the size gap. Gervonta Davis is a tiny man, 5'5", and I reckon his in-the-ring weight is somewhere around 145 to 150 pounds. Meanwhile, Jake Paul is around 6 foot. We're not quite sure. I think he says he's 6'1" or 6'2". I've heard other people saying I think he's closer to 5'11", 6 foot. But the point is he's a much, much taller man. And in the Mike Tyson fight, he was over 220 pounds. So the size difference is massive. This fight's been made at 195-pound catchweight. But after Jake's rehydrated, assuming there's no rehydration clause, which I don't believe there is, he'll probably weigh around 215 pounds in the ring. That means there's a sort of a 60 to 70-pound difference between the two men in the ring on fight night, which is absolutely enormous. There are weight classes for a reason in boxing, and this is the sort of thing that is typically not allowed or permitted. And like I said in my intro, it goes to the heart of that key question in boxing, which is how big is too big? It's the reason that the pound for pound list exists, where we kind of imagine if everybody was the same size, who's the best, who's number one? And it's a debate that rages on and on and on. And so when I see a fight like this, I think the hardcore boxing fans, generally speaking, have felt frustrated by it. Yes, because we want Gervonta Davis as part of the actual sport, competing for world titles against the other elite guys in his weight class. But also because if he gets knocked out and loses to Jake Paul, it creates this illusion that Jake Paul's much better than he actually is. And so I guess the question for me is, can Gervonta Davis beat Jake Paul, or will Jake Paul simply be too massive? Can Jake Paul use his size, or will Gervonta Davis simply be too skilled? What's the answer here? And in trying to answer this, I looked to history. And there's one fight that immediately popped out of my mind and I thought, I wonder what the size difference was there. In fact, it may even be more significant. And it was, and the small guy won. Some of you might be thinking about it right now. It's when David Haye took on the monster, the absolutely ginormous human being, Nikolai Valuev. I think it took place around 2009. So at the time, I was literally a teenager. I didn't have a clue what I was looking at, and I'd fully bought into this David versus Goliath story. But I think it's an excellent example here to draw comparisons between the Gervonta Davis-Jake Paul fight to try and understand whether or not this is a good template and blueprint to try and predict and understand what the size difference might look like in the ring. Now, David Haye was 6'3" and was 217 pounds for the Valuev fight, whereas Valuev was 7 foot tall and weighed 316 pounds. This means that the weight gap was just a tiny bit under 100 pounds, which is obviously 40 pounds more, 35 pounds more than the gap between Davis and Paul. And there was a 9-inch gap in their height versus what seems to be a 7-inch height gap between Gervonta Davis and Jake Paul. And if you go back and watch that fight, David Haye wins it fairly comfortably. He uses his speed, his power, he moves around the outside of the ring and comprehensively outboxes Valuev, even hurting him at one point in the fight. I remember getting so excited seeing it and thinking, God, he's actually managed to wobble the giant. This is ridiculous. And so on the surface, that was a bigger gap, a harder fight for David Haye than Gervonta Davis might find Jake Paul as an opponent. The size gap was significantly bigger. And Nikolai Valuev was a guy who won over 50 fights. This was an actual competitive heavyweight boxer who'd beaten some decent names. So the skill gap as well, in theory, was closer. I suppose the major difference for me in this one is that David Haye was accustomed to fighting heavyweights, or at least cruiserweights. And I do believe that as fighters get bigger, the power difference becomes diminishing returns. I don't think it keeps going up and up and up the bigger you get. I think there's a point where the increase sort of deteriorates, declines. I don't have any scientific evidence for this, but it's just what we see in boxing. We see guys moving up from cruiserweight quite consistently and, being able to compete at the top level. Look at Usyk, for example. He consistently gives up 10s, 20, 30 pounds to much bigger men and is able to beat them up and knock them out. David Haye himself did the same thing at heavyweight. And also, they're just used to taking shots off bigger men. When you're a bigger man, you have a bigger skull, a bigger neck. Science does show you have an increased ability to absorb punches. So in one sense, I do think that it's not an exact comparison, but it does indicate to us that it might be possible for Gervonta Davis, given he's that much better than Jake Paul. I do believe the skill gap between Gervonta Davis and Jake Paul is bigger than the skill gap was between David Haye and Nikolai Valuev. The biggest question I think going into this fight is, can Gervonta Davis actually hurt Jake Paul? Because I'm sure he's going to land on him at some point. The biggest guy that Gervonta Davis fought was Mario Barrios. They fought 140 pounds. Barrios is now up 147 pounds. He recently had a draw with Manny Pacquiao. And in their fight, Davis knocked Barrios down multiple times before TKOing him in round 11. And it wasn't just body shots. Yes, the eventual finish was a body shot, but he knocked him down with shots to the head. Why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because Mario Barrios is a 6-foot man. And I've literally seen some people speculating that Gervonta Davis won't even be able to touch Jake Paul to his head. He very clearly will be able to hit his chin based on the size difference. As I do believe when you look at images, I think Mario Barrios might even be slightly taller than Jake Paul. At the very least, it shows you he can find the chin of taller fighters. Obviously, he's a much, much smaller guy than Jake Paul. The frame is significantly smaller. So whether or not he can actually hurt him when he lands is a different question. I'm inclined to believe that given he is such a hard-punching 135-pounder, that he will be able to hurt Jake Paul enough that he might be deterred from just rushing straight in. I do think that's the case. And also, he's going to be so much faster that he will be able to hit Paul with shots that Paul simply cannot see coming. And those are the ones that always really do hurt. My one concern about Tank Davis, though, is his style. Because Tank Davis is someone who is a very low-output fighter. He's someone who allows his opponent to have success. He allows them to score points and almost land punches on him at times before he downloads the information that he needs and times that knockout shot. Once he's got all the information he needs, he can start landing vicious, hard, powerful counterpunches. And I think to beat a bigger man like Jake Paul, he's going to have to be more active than that. I don't think he can afford to let Jake Paul simply walk into his space and ride the shots out and absorb the punishment. I think he's got to be pretty active with his lead hand. He's got to go to the body with regularity, and he's got to be in and out and fast. I do think he's going to have to adjust his style for this fight. Being the world-class talent he is, I think he can probably do it, but it's just a point that's worth noticing is that I don't think Jake Paul's going to be too bothered by him because of the style that he's seen him put forward so far in his career. He'll probably be thinking, yeah, don't throw too many shots. If you do land a counter punch on me, it's not going to knock me out, and I'll just, beat you up in there because I'm far too big for you. But I do think the fact that Jake Paul himself has stamina issues, I think he very clearly has stamina issues and has had in all his fights, is a good sign for Gervonta Davis himself. I've made a big claim before, a fair claim, I think, that Valuev is a more skilled boxer than Jake Paul. He's achieved far more in his career. And the question was more, how big is the skills gap between Haye and Valuev? Is it bigger than the skill gap between Paul and Davis? I do believe the skill gap between Paul and Davis will be bigger, but it's hard to say definitively how big the skill gap is because we're just not sure how good Jake Paul is still. I just want to make that point really clear. The other factor to consider is this is going to be Gervonta Davis' first time wearing 12-ounce gloves as opposed to 10 ounces in the ring, so he might find that a little different. It will surely diminish his power slightly, but also for him, he'll be hoping that it protects him a little bit more if Jake Paul does land a punch on him. Right now, the most obvious thing to me seems like a Gervonta Davis points win, but there's always that shadow hanging over these Jake Paul fights of just how legitimate are they? It's really, really hard to say. I think that they've been fine so far, but the one that I really did wonder about was that last one against Chavez Jr. because it just took so long for him to show any semblance of ambition in the ring. Other than that, Mike Tyson was clearly far too old, and he's been beating people that, they aren't boxers, so, what are you going to do? So the long and short of it is that I think that maybe Jake Paul isn't too big for Gervonta Davis to win. But the fact he is so big is the only thing that gives him any sort of chance in this fight. Make no mistake about that, because if Jake Paul does somehow win, he won't let you hear anything about the size difference. He won't be interested in it. All he'll want to talk about is the fact that he keeps telling you he's a world level operator, a world level fighter. But these are the reasons that I'm fascinated in this fight. That is not my official pick, by the way, but that is where my logic is naturally leading me right now. I may cover this fight closer to the time if it seems like there's a lot of interest, but I just wanted to make this one right now as we've just had the press conference. But guys, let me know what you think in the comments section below. Can Gervonta Davis win this fight, or is Jake Paul simply too big? I'd love to know what your thoughts are. And as I always say, on to the next one.